In this lecture, we're going to talk now about monitoring, or the process of scouting for pests. When we scout, we are trying to find ways to precisely assess pest pressure on the farm. We can do this by counting the number of insects or symptoms we see. We can also assess crop performance. And basically what we're doing is we're trying to evaluate the economic risk from a pest infestation or disease, as well as to determine the potential effectiveness of some kind of pest control intervention that we're taking. And the reason why we need to monitor or learn how to monitor or scout for pests is that because this is going to shape the thresholds that we're going to define in our IPM program. So we have to get out there on a regular basis, systematically scout, develop a protocol or a method, and make this part of the habit that we take on as a farmer. So the reason why we need to learn how to monitor or be familiar with monitoring is that monitoring is going to help improve our ability to make good pest management decisions. Collecting data is a good idea to have too, especially if you're working for somebody else. You have evidence and quantitative numbers to show somebody and justify your pest management decisions. For example, if you're working with a client. Monitoring also is important because it allows us to detect really early warning signs of potential pest problems and avoid getting to the point where the pest numbers or the damage is going to get out of control. Monitoring also allows us to gather site-specific information. So areas of the farm that may be more prone to pest issues or have more severe pest problems historically, we can flag those sites on the farm and then just keep a close eye on them for the future. Monitoring or scouting also helps us better define the timing of any control measures that we plan to take. So for example, like scouting seasonally, scouting at different times of day. This is going to be important information that we're going to take into consideration when we go to actually put in control measures. Regular scouting for pests also can help a farmer determine patterns of infestations over time, which is also going to provide information on this timing aspect to control those pests. And then also we can see with monitoring whether a pest management method that we're trying out is actually working. We have scouting data from before and during a pest infestation, and then we would continue to scout, monitor, and see if that control measure that we've put in place is actually effective. Ideally, if it were effective, we would see those numbers or the damage start to decrease. So that's the reason why we spend a little bit of time talking about this. And there's lots of ways to scout for pests, monitor for pests. And I've kind of broken the slides up into techniques that are passive techniques. So these are ways that we can gather information about pests and analyze and collect pests over a specific period of time without actually having to go out into the field ourselves and monitor and count insects or diseased plants. And I've just put some examples of ways to passively monitor a farm or in a field. For example, you can use these yellow sticky traps for trapping flying insect pests like aphids and whiteflies. These also come in blue, so they can be used to trap other types of insects like thrips and leaf miners, I believe. Double-sided sticky tape is another passive monitoring technique. Usually place the tape on branches, and it can be used for very similar to the yellow sticky traps. It will collect insects that are walking across those branches. Pheromone traps are another type of passive technique. So inside the trap here is a chemical lure containing insect sex pheromones. And so insects will be attracted to the trap thinking, hey, it's an opportunity to mate, but then they crawl inside and there's a sticky floor and they get stuck. It's very common to see these traps hung in fruit trees around this time of year, like February, March in the early spring. and they monitor for a variety of important fruit tree pests. This trap down here is called a pitfall trap. So another really easy way to catch insects and monitor some numbers over a set time. It's usually used to trap foraging insects that kind of crawl along the surface of the soil. Basically what you do, it's really easy to set up. You just dig a small hole, you place a cup. At the bottom of the cup, you can put a little bit of soap or some water and alcohol, something to kind of trap the insects in there. And then one way to design it is to put a funnel also. So the insects will be, kind of walking across the soil, and then they'll fall into it, and then they can't figure out how to get out of that. Another passive monitoring tool that I put on here, I've had some experience working with growing plants inside in like greenhouses and growth chambers. This is a little data logger called a hobo. Basically, you put this in where your plants are growing, and it can passively monitor all sorts of climate factors like relative humidity. It can take temperature recordings, every hour for a really long period of time. It can measure light levels, lots of different climate factors. And then you just plug it into a computer and you can download all of that information to have that on top of, information about pest numbers as well. So a nice little data logger option. Scouting for pests can also be much more active of an activity where instead of just, counting numbers of pests that get trapped on a yellow sticky card, you now have to go out and count these yourself in a certain area. And there's lots of different sampling techniques that you might choose for this type of scouting method. And much of the time farmers just use, visual inspection. They'll assess like a row of plants or a zone. They may even kind of zoom out and get a bigger picture of a whole field from a distance. In any case, they're trying to get a good assessment and put a count number on pests that you can, directly tie to a threshold. So to count pests that are very, very small, they'll usually use a hand lens. It's like a little small magnifying glass that you can, keep in your pocket or wear around your neck on a loop. This is a really handy little tool to have for getting up close and looking at aphids and thrips and scale insects and mites and things like that. There are other techniques you can use. For example, the method here, this is called a beating tray. So this is just a flat surface that you would hold under a branch, and then you would have a stick that you would gently hit the branch, and any insects that are crawling around that tree would fall into the tray. And you can do this at different areas of like an orchard or something, and you can count what's fallen into that tray and get a good idea of what sort of insects are around your farm. You can also collect insects using a sweep net. This guy up here, he's sweeping for various insect pests. And you can sweep, along a transect, which is just a straight run of plants, or you can sample from within a set area, like have a quadrant that you define and sweep for a certain period of time and see what you collect. Most of the time, these little quadrants, like this guy here, is generally used for weeds, like counting weeds. So you'll randomly place the quadrant frame at random spots around your field, and then you'll count the number of weed species that kind of fall within that frame. So as you do these sorts of sampling techniques, it's also going to be really important to keep good records of all this information that you're collecting. And this doesn't have to be like super complex. You can start pretty simple here. You can collect information about how you're sampling, as well as, the climate that you're sampling in. You might also want to include like the results of your sampling method, like the number of pests you observe, the stage of the crops that you're sampling from, and maybe the amount of damage that's present. But you can go crazy and record lots of information, like the number of beneficial organisms you see. It's also probably a good idea to take note of any kind of cultural practices that you're doing, like how much water you're applying, if you've applied fertilizer recently, how you cultivated the beds. All of this is important information to have on hand that might affect your management decisions. So record keeping, very important skill to develop as a farmer, especially when it comes to IPM and scouting. Now, these kinds of sampling techniques, they can get a little daunting, but honestly, it's not like you need to go out and count all of the aphids that you see on every single plant in your garden or your farm. There are ways to cover large areas of a farm effectively. And the way farmers will usually do this is to decide on a pattern. Normally it's a W or a Z pattern, or they'll alternate the rows that they walk so that they can cover that whole entire field or that zone and get a good sense of the pest numbers across the entire area. Okay, rather than walking every single row and looking at every single plant, that would take you days to get a good picture. So if you've taken an IPM class before, or if you plan to take one in the future, you would probably develop out a specific scouting protocol and learn how to do this in more detail. But just very briefly, it basically involves first trying to identify the area that you're sampling, whether it's a block of plants or a field or a smaller zone. And then you would walk a W, walk a Z, and work your way through that field and identify smaller manageable units that you would sample from, like every 4 plants, or I would sample every 12 feet. You would decide on that. And then within your plan, you would even say, okay, I'm going to sample from X number of leaves. I will look only at fruits. I will sample the roots. You define these little units that you're going to sample from and have a protocol that you would run through every single time you scout. So why do we do this? Well, this is the basis for figuring out what our thresholds are going to be. So based on pest numbers and the level of damage in IPM, we need to come up with some kind of threshold. We need to be able to define at what point is it going to be necessary to step in and start to control these pests. And for many pest species, a certain number and a certain amount of damage is going to be totally fine. But there will be some point inevitably that you would have to determine through your scouting protocol and the data that you're collecting that you're going to find it necessary to act to control that pest. And usually in the agricultural industry, or if you're growing plants, say for like a nursery, this threshold here that we're going to define is usually going to be somehow tied to the economics of that enterprise. Usually there's a level at which you start to lose money because the pest is present and damaging your plants. But if you're growing, for like a home garden, this threshold, you still need to determine it, but it might be something different that you value from that landscape, like the function of your garden, the aesthetic of it, maybe it's the yield that you're producing, whatever it is that you value. So we still need to define what that threshold is. So in the plot here, you can see like over time, the blue line here is our pest number, or it can be the level of damage. This is going to fluctuate a lot with climate and with irrigation and cultural practices and tillage. But there will be some point where the pest numbers hit a threshold. And this is the point where you need to apply some kind of control. You need to step in and take action and try to suppress the pest. And again, for farmers, this number, this value here will tell us when we will start to lose money. So that's when we have to suppress that pest. So in IPM though, we never want to get to that point where we start losing money. So what we do is we set 2 types of thresholds. Okay, we have first what's called the economic injury level, the EIL, which is in blue here on the graph. This is the lowest pest population, that level of pests or damage that will cause economic losses. Okay, this is the point of no return. The pest population might get out of control here and we're going to lose a bunch of money. We never want to get to this line, ideally. We don't want to get up here. If we do get to the EIL or above it, the benefits of managing the pest greatly outweigh the costs to implement the pest control techniques. Okay, so we're going to step in and we're going to apply management decisions based on that management triangle. If we're below the EIL, the costs to manage the pest outweigh the benefits of controlling it. So we're not going to need to step in to manage the pest. We're just going to have to do preventative techniques. Okay. So to avoid getting to this EIL, farmers will also usually set a threshold below this level. They call this the action threshold. And this is set in order to prevent you from reaching the EIL. Okay, the action threshold is the point at which management action should be taken to prevent increases in pest populations from exceeding the EIL where we start to lose money. Okay, so the action threshold is almost always lower than the EIL. And it's considered the point where you need to step in and start to act against the pest. All right, so how do we establish these levels? Again, through systematic monitoring, scouting for pests on your farm, keeping good records, collecting quantitative data to back up your management decisions, and also keeping in mind that these values might be flexible. Your action threshold may actually change over time. So being flexible and learning to adjust your guidelines where appropriate are also going to come into play. But always realize you never need to control a pest if you are below the economic threshold. You only need to act to prevent it through cultural care, which you're going to learn about in the next lecture.